Alright, so it's been about 2 years now since I've owned a Nintendo Switch. I gave it up right at the start of 2020 on the heels of having only played it for about 6 hours the year before, and at the time there really wasn't much that interested me on the system. I'm not a Smash Brothers fan, and I'm not here for Animal Crossing. I had already played many of the first-party titles when they initially came out on the Wii U, so in March of 2020 I made the decision to sell the console and get my money back, and then some, and then I decided I would just wait for a hardware revision to jump back in, and that's exactly what I did. So why now? Well, it's the winter. Working on arcade machines outside in the cold is not really a preferred activity of mine. I wanted something a little different for the upcoming colder months. Still have a healthy library here that I'd like to play, and well, there is that new OLED model that I want to comment on in a second, but it's really about the games that I want to play on this system. So before we get into the games that drug me back into being a Nintendo Switch owner, I want to mention, as a naysayer, as someone who doesn't fawn over Nintendo the way I once did, as someone who was disillusioned by Nintendo rehashing the Wii U library, at full retail pricing I might add, on what was supposed to be a new console, as someone who was highly skeptical, the OLED Switch was a pleasant surprise. The slightly larger screen is more noticeable than I anticipated it being, and it's just so vibrant and colorful. Games really pop on this display, and while I wouldn't go overboard with terms like breathtaking or shocking, it is a solid upgrade over the original. Maybe less of a technical marvel, but something I've also really appreciated is the new dock. My launch Switch always felt wobbly in its dock and on occasion would even topple over. The OLED Switch seems to have a lower center of gravity when it's docked, and that helps keep things a little bit more stable. Alright though, let's talk about the games. These are the real reason I got sucked back into the Nintendo Switch world. I'll go ahead and start with some NG dev games. And I mean, look, I am a big Neo Geo guy, and everyone always asks if I play these. To date, the only game I had really played from them was Crowdbuster, and I sold it to buy my big blue cabinet. And NG Dev promptly unfollowed me on Twitter after I made that video. Nice. But let me tell you, although Crowdbuster wasn't necessarily my thing, Razion X, man, I've been sitting on this and was finally able to play it, and it did not disappoint. The graphics and setting remind me a lot of Pulsar. Even the second level of this has the water cavern thing going on. I know it isn't a one-for-one or anything, especially gameplay-wise, but visually there seems to be more than a few nods to Pulsar in this game. Lastly, the music for this is absolutely fantastic. Some really great tracks throughout this entire game. Another NG Dev game that I've always wanted to try is Gunlord. This is always a really expensive game for Neo Geo when it does pop up, so thankfully NG Dev released it for Switch and PS4 a few years back. I've not spent a lot of time with this yet. It's obviously similar to the Turrican games, which certainly isn't a bad thing if you're a fan of that series. Now again, I've not spent much time with this, but from the little bit that I have invested, I'm pleasantly pleased. Its controls are pretty snappy, and being a fan of the aforementioned Turrican series, I felt pretty comfortable right away. I'm looking forward to hopefully finishing this one off in the first quarter. So see, NG Dev, I do like your games, and will definitely continue to buy them for modern hardware. These two titles are stellar on Switch and really shine. Having them available here gives a wider audience access to play them, which is great considering that even some Neo Geo people like myself aren't going to hunt down the AES or MVS versions and drop $1,000 on something that isn't truly part of the original library. Now here's another game I kind of missed having the ability to play via console, Virtua Racing. It gets a little cool in the basement for playing on the actual arcade machine, and I typically have to play that one solo. Well, if I'm being completely honest here, I have never been able to find a match on Virtua Racing on Nintendo Switch either. So in that respect, it's exactly like playing the arcade version in my basement. solo laps around a track for best time purposes. Jokes aside, I do like that this game received a facelift for the Switch, and its super smooth and silky gameplay is very on point. It's nice to be able to play this version of the game on a console again, but I really wish that it had a wider reach with players. Multiplayer matchups would be highly ideal to have here, but I suppose Sega's somewhat deeper bench arcade games aren't quite as popular with the Switch's user base as I may have thought. Like many games, everyone seemed to gush over this when it first dropped, but there certainly doesn't ever seem to be anyone around who is actually playing it. Next up on my list here is g-darius, and this got a sweet HD remake for Nintendo Switch and was only $16 in physical form. I was really curious to try this out and see the revamped visuals on Switch after having been turned onto it on, well, somewhat original hardware. The Taito GNet system is capable of running this game via a modded BIOS and compact flash cart, somewhat similar to the Atomic Wave games on Naomi 2 hardware. We don't need to get into that here, and I may talk about GNet in another video this year. But for $16 you do get the original version of the game, which of course looks a little more dated and blockier when compared to the HD version. I've enjoyed playing this a few times on the Astro City arcade cabinet, but it's cool to see this cleaned up and polished for modern hardware. I hesitate to say better than arcade perfect. I don't really like that term and personally think that it's a bit of an oxymoron, but this one makes a strong argument for exemplifying just what is implied by that term. It's tough to ignore the sharper visuals and slamming audio tracks that have been brought up to speed with current times, the former of which looks great on a modern display. Speaking of arcade games, here is a machine I guarantee I will never own, Darius Burst, another Chronicle. This is a beast of a machine that features two LCD screens side by side to create an ultra-wide perspective and experience. I've never had the pleasure of playing on one of these, so it's nice to now have the experience on Switch. As you might suspect, to mimic the ultra-wide view on a single screen, the game has to be letterboxed a little, so you'll have those black bars on the top and bottom. I did clear this game a few times already, but am by no means an expert. I do feel safe saying that I really like what it has to offer, something a little different with its huge landscape view. It changes your strategies up enough to make it stand out from other titles in the genre, especially in regards to timing. Alright, we all know the Switch is a port machine. I have a lot of opinions on that, particularly as it relates to the Wii U stuff. I'm not going to get into that again. But in the case of the N64, well, I can say that I'm thankful some of this is crossing over, mainly because I don't really have a lot of love for the N64, but thankfully some of the games I did genuinely enjoy are finding their way over to the Switch. Doom 64 is one such game, and I have to say, wow, I was pleasantly surprised when I loaded this up for the first time. Seeing this run with an enhanced resolution is phenomenal. This is for sure the way to play Doom 64 going forward. I played through this on the N64 about 3 or 4 years ago, and it was as great as I had remembered it being back in the day, so it was still relatively fresh in my mind. And seeing this load and look this good really makes me want to play through it all over again. And look, I know that we should expect this kind of enhancement if you're going to port games over to newer hardware. It doesn't always happen that way, does it? I'm just trying to give some credit here where credit is due. Even if that bar is somewhat of a low one, you and I both know it fails to be cleared at times. While we're talking N64 ports, I'll go ahead and show these two off as well. No regrets here either. I got Seeds of Evil for Christmas along with the expansion pack a long time ago, and I really enjoyed it then, so it was just something that I wanted to have here, if only to prevent me from having to keep an N64 out and connected. There are still a few N64 games that I enjoy that haven't been ported over and given the modern day facelift, but these at least cross a few more off of my work list. So I do have some other titles here, quite a few actually, some of which are still shrink-wrapped from when I grabbed them because at the time I had no real way of playing them. I knew eventually I would grab another Nintendo Switch. I just kind of had thought it would be that long-rumored Pro model, which I'm sure even as you're watching this, is being rumored yet again from another insider source. But honestly, with the winter here and not much arcade stuff happening for me, I decided 2 years was a long enough break and I wanted to dive back into the world of Nintendo Switch. Overall, I'm really pleased with this model of the Nintendo Switch, and the larger screen size does really help. The Pro Controller is a must in my opinion because I still hate the Joy-Cons every bit as much as the first time I owned a Switch, but that's an easily solved problem, and I did hold on to my 2 Pro Controllers from before. Aside from the 4K capability, if I had one minor complaint, it's that I wish there were an easier way to insert your game cards into the Switch. I really hate fiddling with that plastic cap thing on the top, and maybe even more so when the Switch is docked. A spring door would be great even if they added a second one onto the dock itself, which I know wouldn't happen because of redundancy and cost control, but hey, a guy can dream. Anyways, I'm back to being a current-gen Nintendo console owner, and I'm pretty happy about it. I'm probably not playing a lot of the same games that other people are, but that's also what makes having a vast library like the Switch is so great, and ultimately, it's what helps it appeal to a really wide audience. So let me know in the comments down below what games, or even arcade games, you might be playing on the Switch. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will catch you all next time. Later, guys.